Hi, my name's Phil and welcome to LabourVision, where we take a look at Labour policies. In this video, with news that Thames Water faces bankruptcy without a bailout from somewhere and their own investors being reluctant to help very much, it's worth taking a look at what Labour are saying about the situation, what their policies state, and so what they might actually do if the situation is not resolved by the time they form a government. So since privatisation, water companies have racked up huge debts. Remember that when they were owned by the state, they had zero debts. They were being run responsibly with outgoings matching income. So why have water companies run up such huge debts? Is it to pay for all the infrastructure that they promised to upgrade? No, they did borrow for infrastructure spending, that is true, but they didn't spend the loaned money on upgrading very much, but shareholder dividends instead. Now, if a corporation in the private sector did this, people would be going to prison. For some reason, this was permitted by successive governments in the case of water companies. And now the situation is that water companies have not modernised our infrastructure, but because they considered themselves a money printing firm, they've loaded themselves up with so much debt that they can't even keep themselves afloat. Their business model is fracturing. And Thames Water looks like the first to go to the wall. Their failure was also thrown into sharp focus this weekend with the traditional Oxford versus Cambridge boat race along the Thames. The Thames is so full of E. coli that the water can literally kill you. I do not know why the rowers agreed to go ahead with it. I get that they're like rowing and this is a premier event, but both Cambridge and Oxford rowers have become ill as a result of the race, bringing the issue to national attention again. And in a weird twist, Jacob Rees-Mogg earlier this week seemed to argue that he definitely explicitly argued that Thames Water should be allowed to go bankrupt. Doesn't appear to mind nationalising the company at all. So what about Labour? Well, I've often thought that Labour's policies for water companies, which are many and detailed, would inevitably lead to nationalisation. Not in the quick hand over hundreds of billions to buy them and lose the next general election. In fact, the next generation of general elections type of nationalising, but in a wait for them to collapse, leave them with their debts and take over the service at minimal cost type of way. For example, what are Labour's explicit policies? Well, I've discussed them before in this series, but as it's more topical now, just a few of the key ones. First, fines must be paid for by the water companies, not added to customers' bills. That means water companies face genuine financial penalties for receiving fines. Second, striking off company directors who repeatedly breach the rules, so a personal liability for the individuals running the water companies. Third, ensuring illegal activity is punished. There have been hints that criminal action could finally be levied against all these dodgy practices at last. Fourth, that dividend payouts are linked to performance metrics. Now, this one is crucial because if the company can't pay out dividends or can't pay out enough because it's not meeting its targets, then people will not want to invest and their business model collapses. Fifth, mandatory monitoring with fines if they don't, and automatic fines if they discharge sewage. So water companies will be forced to pay either way. They can either pay to treat the sewage or they can pay for dumping it, and because they won't be allowed to add it to customers' bills, they will have to either come up with a functioning business model or fold. So with Thames Water in the shit, literally as well as metaphorically, and their own investors now saying they don't fancy bailing them out, what are Labour saying about it? Well, Louise Haigh, Labour's Transport Shadow Secretary of State, has said they don't have the time or money to be nationalising water companies right now, explaining that it would take a long time to unpick the regulatory framework of our privatised water companies, but that the government should get much tougher on regulations for water companies. So the surface reading is no nationalisation of water companies, but let's consider the detail of what she's just said. First of all, Haigh said they don't have time for nationalising water companies right now. That doesn't mean support for the current system. It's a short-term position. It's also not support for the current system, just saying that they can't change it quickly. Second detail to note is that Haigh was being asked specifically about Thames Water, but she responded with a general position about water companies. Politicians' answer. Remember that Labour are having to be very careful to avoid letting the Conservatives accuse them of overspending, so they're not leaving room for the general election campaign to turn into one of Labour being accused of planning to spend massively, growing the debt in order to buy out privatised services. The third detail is saying that nationalising now isn't feasible because of time and money. But what happens with Thames Water specifically? If the situation isn't resolved when Labour are in government, I mean, they can't operate long term with their current financial situation. Their investors are not stumping up the money to bail them out. What would Labour do? Would they bail Thames Water out with public money? Well, according to the Financial Times, Thames Water are looking for investors to provide £3 billion worth of equity to let it stagger on until 2030. There's also talk of customers having to pay 40% higher bills over the next Parliament to cover this. Now, if Thames Water cannot arrange for that £3 billion privately, they're surely not going to get it from a Labour government. And as for the 40% higher bills, can you imagine the first act of a new Labour government fighting on a platform of tackling the cost of living crisis being to put up people's utility bills by 40%? Part of what investors want in return for that funding is for Ofwat to go easy on fines as well. Again, this would be dead against Labour policy. The Tories might agree to it, so it might all be done and dusted before Labour form a government. But, their time is limited. So what would a Labour government do? Well, agree to go easy on holding Thames Water to their regulatory responsibilities in order to give in to the demands of investment? No, that is dead against their own policies and would allow them to carry on dumping raw sewage, which is a massive vote leader for the Tories and would of course be for a Labour government that allowed it as well. Especially as we're going to have a Labour government that hopefully wants to stay in power for a while. So that's out of the question. Would they provide the funds out of the public purse? Well, with Labour wanting to invest more but having little fiscal headroom, that would be a pointless waste of their budget. Would they allow customers to see their bills go up by 40% so that private investors provide the money? I mean, that would be very noticeable and very unpopular, especially during a cost of living crisis. Now, what Labour would do is implement their water policies, which have already been stated, and accept all water companies, including Thames Water, to comply or face the consequences. And this is likely to see the company fail financially. And I see no alternative other than the state taking control. It may even be that the Conservatives have to take control before Labour get a chance. Now, that's not strictly nationalisation in the normal terms to begin with, a simple takeover just to manage the operation again. This has happened before with other private enterprises. But if it happens with other companies as well, water companies, and Labour need to take over more of them, then we're back to focusing in on what Labour just said about don't have the time to nationalise right now. Doesn't need to be right now, does it? Take over individual water companies for little cost as they fail, and then deal with the formal renationalisation over time. Consider, for example, how Labour are going to nationalise rail by simply taking control of individual rail operators as their private contracts expire, not costing them a penny for doing so. That's really how I see Labour doing the same with other utilities, but of course water companies have been running such a disastrous business model that they are the easiest to pick off in the foreseeable future. But there we are. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to the channel and click the like button. And until next time, I'll see you later.